What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the Neighborhood Podcast. One host of the podcast, my name is Kyle Dabro. In today's episode, it's just going to be me. I know Kev is still dealing with his situation at his apartment complex. He is keeping up to date with all of the NFL news as we go along throughout the season. Hopefully, he does come back sooner rather than later. But for this episode specifically, it's just going to be me going over some of the Week 2 highlight games that we saw from this past weekend. It was a very exciting weekend of football as far as I'm concerned. It ended on a pretty sad note. If you guys were watching the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Cleveland Browns game from last night, where Nick Chubb sustained what looked to be a pretty significant knee injury. When I was watching the game last night, I think he suffered a pretty significant kneecap issue where he could have potentially dislocated his kneecap. This is the same kneecap where he suffered a pretty significant injury in college back in 2015, and he missed a significant amount of time from that injury, and I wouldn't be surprised if he misses a similar amount of time when it comes to this injury. That's one of the games that we'll talk about. We'll talk about Cleveland and Pittsburgh last night. The Steelers got the win, but obviously the biggest takeaway from that game is Nick Chubb is going to be out for an extended period of time at least. He's definitely going to miss the rest of this season. And the question of whether or not that this could be a career-ending injury is actually up for debate at this point. So we'll talk about that game first. After that, we'll talk about the Cowboys just absolutely dominating the New York Jets this past weekend. The Cowboys have been off to a fantastic start. They beat the Jets by the score of 30-10. I mean, when you look at the Cowboys from top to bottom, offense, defense, you could throw in special teams in there as well. They're probably off to the best start compared to any NFL team this season so far. They're only averaging on defense 5 points per game. And then on top of that, you have the offense that's averaging 35 points per game. Granted, we're only 2 games in, but nonetheless, the Cowboys are off to a fantastic start. And we'll talk about them a little bit more in depth when we talk about that game a little bit later on. After that, we will talk about, I'm just looking at what I have on my list here. We've got the Baltimore Ravens going up against the Cincinnati Bengals, where kind of a surprise game if you're looking at it from a Bengals perspective. The Bengals are off to an 0-2 start. And granted, when we looked at the Bengals last year, they got off to kind of a slow start as well. They lost their season opener at home to the Steelers. And this was a big divisional game for them, obviously, when it comes to the Ravens. The Ravens are going to be one of those teams vying for the top spot in the AFC North. And for them to get a huge road win early on in the season against a top flight team with the Bengals, you definitely got to give them respect. But I think the bigger takeaway here is just the Bengals. Once again, they start off slow in this game. Granted, they weren't as bad in the second game compared to their season opener, but nonetheless, they are starting at an 0-2 hole after losing to the Ravens by the score of 27-24. So we'll talk about that game a little bit later. After that, we'll talk about the Sunday night game that featured the New England Patriots and the Miami Dolphins. The Dolphins won in Gillette by the score of 24-17. Looking back at this game just as like a quick hitter, Miami probably should have won this game by a larger margin. New England kind of stuck around, made things interesting toward the end, but Miami was able to shut down a potential game-tying drive from New England at the end of the fourth quarter that iced the game. And Miami's off to a very good start. They're off to a 2-0 start, and it looks like the offense, just looking at how Tua is running the offense, Mike McDaniel, they're doing a great job so far. Like I said, that the game probably should have been more of a blowout in favor of Miami, but nonetheless, a 2-0 start is pretty solid for them, and to win both of those games on the road, gotta say, Miami looks pretty good so far. And then to wrap up the episode, we will talk about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Bucs have been probably one of the biggest surprises, as far as I see it, to start off the year. Granted, we're only in September, and things can change from now until, October. I mean, the Bucs could go on a 2 to 3 game slide, and they could kind of fall into the expectation that I had for them this year. But they defeated the Chicago Bears this past weekend at home. Kind of a close game, kind of back and forth, but Tampa was able to close it out towards the end. Shaq Barrett got a pick six against Justin Fields on, I think it was a screenplay that the Bears had run on 3 straight plays. And that touchdown from Shaq Barrett pretty much iced the game in favor for the Bucs. But as far as I see it, I'll dive into a little bit more in depth when it comes to just how surprising the Bucs have been. Obviously, they moved on from Tom Brady after he decided to retire. This past offseason, they brought Baker Mayfield into the fold. And I got to say, they have really surprised me so far, and they've proven me wrong in the first 2 weeks of the year. So that'll be pretty much the rundown for the episode. So let's not waste any more time. Let's dive into this Pittsburgh Steelers Cleveland Browns matchup. So diving into this game, obviously, this is a huge AFC North divisional rivalry game between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh gets the win by the score of 26-22. Just talking about the game real quick. Pittsburgh is lucky to have won this game simply just because their defense single-handedly carried them in this game. First play of the game, they're able to get a pick six off of Deshaun Watson to put them up 7-0. And then after that, it was kind of a slugfest between these two teams, especially offensively. It just didn't seem like the Steelers really got into any sort of rhythm offensively throughout the game. Granted, they had plays here and there where they were able to show some life. The one play in particular was where Kenny Pickett was able to connect with George Pickens for a 70-yard, I think it was a 71-yard touchdown, where he was able to break away from everybody on Cleveland's defense to put a touchdown up on the board for the Steelers. But, looking at that play in particular, just because they scored a touchdown on that play, Kenny Pickett took a pretty big hit from Cleveland's pass rush on that play. Granted, it worked out for the Steelers, but just the pressure that Cleveland was able to bring throughout that game was quite impressive. And when I look at Cleveland's defense, they definitely made this interesting just because Pittsburgh's offense is kind of stagnant, to say the least. They don't really have a run game because their offensive line is, let's just say it, fairly weak. They're not able to open up run lanes for Najee Harris. Their passing game is mediocre, and I think mediocre is kind of putting it mildly. Kenny Pickett is really not able to establish really any sort of consistent connections with his receivers. On top of that, they're down Deontay Johnson. He's going to be out for the next couple of weeks on IR. And it just seems like the timing that Kenny is having with the offense, the lack of a run game, the inconsistencies on the offensive line. Offensively, Pittsburgh is really struggling. And I know a lot of people were hyped about Pittsburgh potentially being a pretty good team in the AFC North this year from what they had seen in the preseason, where the offense looked pretty good. They looked consistent. But now that we're in the regular season, all those, I guess, high expectations that they had for the Steelers offense have kind of come back down to earth. And it's really the defense that has really stepped up and have made plays for the Steelers as a whole. Really, when I look at this game, the Steelers are really lucky to win this game, like I mentioned, simply just because when you have the defense score 2 touchdowns for you, more times than not, you're probably going to win that game simply just because of what the defense is putting out there for you. And in that fourth quarter, where Cleveland had a 3-point lead, I believe the score was 22-19 with about 6-7 minutes left to go in the game, the Steelers were able to get a strip sack, and then TJ Watt was able to pick it up and run it in for a scoop and score. And then that was essentially the last scoring drive, or really the last scoring play of the game. After that, it was just kind of back and forth with both teams not really being able to move the ball effectively against the opposing defense. But overall, the Steelers definitely needed this win. They got absolutely embarrassed by the 49ers at home in their season opener. And for them to bounce back in this manner, it's a good win for them. But I have to say, this defense is single-handedly carrying this team as far as I see it for the foreseeable future. Because the offense, I know a lot of people have talked about Matt Canada and the job that he has brought to that offensive coordinator position over the last couple of years. It really hasn't worked out effectively. It's definitely something of note. And the fans definitely took a lot away from this game simply just because if you had watched some of the Twitter highlights, or if you'd watched the game, you could hear from the crowd that they were essentially asking for the firing of Matt Canada. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Steelers offensively continue to struggle throughout the rest of this season. I wouldn't even say the rest of the season. Let's just say for the next month and a half. I think those calls will definitely get louder if the offense is not able to get anything of positive production moving forward here. So I think this defense is really going to be the focal piece of this team. It's kind of indicative and symbolic of what the Steelers have been. They're a team that's largely been focused around their defense. They're very defensive centric, but there are going to be some of these games where if the offense is not producing, the defense is going to get exhausted just because they're out there on the field too much. This game, they were able to force some turnovers, get some sacks, and that was really those are the factors that led to the Steelers winning this game. But I have to say, just putting this game to the side, the biggest unfortunate piece that I have to talk about here is Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb is out for the rest of the regular season after sustaining what looked to be a dislocated kneecap. Uh, the Browns were in the red zone. Nick Chubb was on just a simple dive play up the middle, and he took a pretty big shot to his knee. And, when you take those shots, especially when you're planting your foot and you're exposing that knee area, it's always a recipe for potential disaster. And unfortunately, in this case, Nick Chubb sustained what looked to be a season-ending injury. I wouldn't be surprised if we're looking at a dislocated kneecap, if we're talking about multiple ligaments being torn. And I think the safe bet, more than likely, that not only is he going to miss the rest of this NFL season, I mean, there's a potential chance that this could be a career-ending injury, simply just because that he sustained a very similar injury to the same knee back in college almost 10 years ago. This injury that he had was back in 2015. And to suffer the same injury, essentially to the same, and essentially the same way to the same knee, man, that is a tough one to bounce back from. And, when you look at Nick Chubb has been one of the most productive running backs that the Browns have ever had. I mean, when you look at Nick Chubb, his average yards per carry is around 4.5 yards. I mean, that is extremely impressive. And Nick Chubb has been not only one of the best, he hasn't been, how should I say this? He's been one of the better running backs that we've seen in this generation. And it's unfortunate to see him go down with such a significant injury that the Browns are so heavily relied upon when it comes to their offense. I mean, their run game is through him. And when you look at Ford, their backup, he's going to have to take a lot of responsibilities here. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Browns look to potentially bring back Kareem Hunt. Cam Akers is on the trade block. So that running back core is going to go through some changes and it's going to go through some adjustments because of Nick Chubb's injury. It's just simply a devastating blow to this offense because, through the first 2 games of this year, the offense has been up and down. They looked great against the Bengals in week 1, where they were able to establish consistency. They were able to establish a good drives with the run game and the passing game from Deshaun, even though the Deshaun, I wouldn't say this isn't the best Deshaun that we've seen at the quarterback position as far as his passing is concerned. We have seen better passing production from him when he was a member of the Houston Texans. But, looking at where this offense is right now, this offense is going to be in flux for the next couple of weeks if they're going to try to figure this situation out with Nick Chubb no longer being a part of this offense for the rest of this season. Hopefully Nick Chubb is able to come back from this injury. It would be an absolute shame and be an absolute travesty as far as I'm concerned if this was it for his career based on this injury. Hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully he's able to come back from this injury and bring what he's always brought to the table for the Cleveland Browns. But he has an uphill battle when it comes to his recovery here. Obviously, he'll get surgery, and then that recovery process is going to be a lengthy one as far as I'm concerned. It really was just a terrible thing to see just because of how productive and how good of a running back Nick Chubb is, not just for the Browns, but for the NFL as a whole. He's been one of the most productive running backs that we've seen in this generation of running backs. And just a tough scene to see. It was a gruesome injury. I know that ESPN had cut away from showing the replay. I was able to catch one of the replays on Twitter, and they were able to show a slowed down, a slow-mo version or a slow-mo replay of the hit that he sustained, and it was a tough one to watch. I've seen worse injuries. The one that will always stick in my mind will be the Kevin Ware injury, where he suffered a compound fracture of his lower leg in it was in March Madness when Louisville was going up against Duke. But, I mean, this one is definitely in the running. I have seen knee dislocations of this. I remember, I think it was Marcus Lattimore, back when he was a member of the South Carolina Gamecocks. He suffered a knee dislocation against I believe it was against Tennessee. This was a while back. I don't know if it was 10 years ago at this point. It seems like time just flies at this point. But, those knee dislocations, they are tough to watch. Just seeing the knee twist and the leg turn the way that it did. I know legs are not supposed to do that. And hopefully, Nick Chubb can come back. I'm just wishing him a speedy recovery. And, I hope everything works out for him in the long run because he's got an uphill battle when it comes to this recovery process. Not going to be an easy one, especially sustaining a very similar injury that he sustained to the same knee almost 10 years ago. So we'll hope for the best when it comes to Nick Chubb. But after that, we will transition to the Dallas Cowboys, just absolutely dominating the New York Jets this past weekend. The Cowboys won by the score of 30-10. And, when you look at the Cowboys throughout the first two games of the year, as far as I'm concerned, they do look like the best team in the NFL at this point. You can make a case that teams like the 49ers are definitely in contention. But I have to say, just from what I've seen from the Cowboys, from offense, defense, this is a very well-rounded team at this point. Now, granted, we are talking about the Cowboys. The Cowboys, throughout the last 20, 25 years, have always found a way to screw things up. But I have to say, just on how they've started, there is some legitimate hype behind this team. Dak Prescott looks very good so far throughout the first two games. He's very efficient. His completion percentage, pretty high. When you look back at this game, 31 of 38, 255 yards, 2 touchdowns. He's leading the offense extremely well here. He's getting protected. They're getting good contributions from the ground game. Tony Pollard is their premier back. They've moved on from Ezekiel Elliott. And, when you look at Tony Pollard, granted, he hasn't had one of his breakout games yet, but he's been effective not only in the run game, but in the passing game as well. And I think if they're able to get that type of utilization out of him, where he's getting somewhere around 20, 25 carries a game, probably is getting around, I'd say 5 to about 7 targets in the passing game, he's going to be great for them. If you have him on fantasy, I think he's definitely going to bring wonders to your fantasy team this year. I remember last year I had him on my fantasy team. I made a trade for him with one of my buddies in my fantasy league. And there was probably, I want to say, like a 5 to 6 game stretch where he was getting over 30 fantasy points a game, where he was getting multiple touchdowns, getting over 100 yards on the ground. And granted, we haven't seen that type of production from Tony Pollard yet, but I would expect some games where they're going to heavily rely on him. They're going to take the pressure off of Dak, and they're just going to let the run game take over, especially with the offensive line that these guys have. Cowboys have a pretty good offensive line here, and if they're able to open up these run lanes for Tony Pollard, there's going to be some nice things that this offense is going to see with Tony Pollard leading the way. Obviously, when you look back at this game in particular, CeeDee Lamb was just a nightmare when it came to the Jets secondary. The Jets secondary had no answer for this guy. CeeDee Lamb had 11 catches for 143 yards. Granted, he didn't get a touchdown, but there were just too many times where CeeDee Lamb was just wide open. There were just no Jets in the vicinity around CeeDee Lamb on some of these plays. And, when you got Dak Prescott, who's got time to work with in the pocket, that's a nightmare situation if you're the Jets from a defensive perspective. And then on top of that, when you look at what the defense is presenting, Zach Wilson really didn't have much time to work with because he was basically I'm going to be a little bit, I guess, explicit with it. Micah Parsons was just hunting the entire day, looking back at that Sunday matchup. I mean, granted, he only had 2 sacks in this game, but he was bringing hellacious pass rushes. He was bringing pressure. And Zach Wilson had to get the ball out extremely quick, or he ended up taking a sack from Micah Parsons. And then on top of that, the rest of the Cowboys pass rush. This pass rush looks extremely viable from Dallas moving forward. And we could look back to last year. Granted, it didn't end well for them because they ended up falling to the 49ers in the divisional round last year. But if you're looking at this defense looks like they have their ears pinned back, and they are just rushing the quarterback extremely effectively. Not only that, they're pretty much keeping the opposing run games that they faced so far to essentially non-existent performances. When you look at the Jets in this game, their leading rusher was Zach Wilson. They had no ground game whatsoever. And Breece Hall is a pretty nice running back here. So if you look at the Cowboys, just from top to bottom, they're off to a fantastic start. But we're only in September. There's a lot of time left for the Cowboys to screw things up. So I wouldn't be surprised, if you look at Cowboys fans, they're probably on the moon right now. They're extremely excited about where this team is going as far as the direction is concerned. But I guarantee you, if the Cowboys get on some sort of losing streak here, maybe sometime in October or in November, people are going to look to Mike McCarthy because apparently Mike McCarthy is the scapegoat of this team, even though there have been a lot of people talking about Jerry Jones over the last, I don't know, 25, 30 years about how he's managed this team, they will always look to Mike McCarthy as a scapegoat here if things go south for the Cowboys. But at this point, the Cowboys look like they're the best team in the NFL. I mean, they're averaging 35 points per game offensively. They're only giving up 5 points per game defensively. I mean, they threw a shutout against the Giants in week 1, and then, against another New York team, they only held them to 10 points. The team looks pretty good right now, but like I said, it's only September, still early, but they're off to a fantastic start. And I don't think it's a controversial statement at this point to say that they're probably the best team in the NFL. And if they're not that, they're definitely in the top 3 to top 5 teams in the NFL as far as I see it. So it's a good win for the Cowboys, especially with it being their home opener against the Jets this past weekend. Moving on, we are going to transition to the Baltimore Ravens and the Cincinnati Bengals game. Got a big rivalry game here in the AFC North, but the Ravens go on the road, defeat the Cincinnati Bengals by the score of 27-24, and the Ravens are off to a 2-0 start. And, when you look at this game in particular, these games are always going to be close. These teams see each other twice a year. And, this was a pretty big matchup early in the year, especially with it being in the second week of the 2023 season. And this was a game, looking into this game before it took place, I wanted to see if the Bengals offense can bounce back from the horrendous performance that they had against the Browns in the season opener for them. They scored 3 points. Joe Burrow had 82 yards passing. And, for a guy that just signed this massive contract extension to be, well, I think at the time he was the highest paid quarterback. I think now that Patrick Mahomes got his contract reworked, I think now he is going to receive the most amount of money over like a 3-year span. But I mean, contractually speaking, Joe Burrow is going to be making a ton of money over the next, over the foreseeable future. To come back from that performance, I mean, obviously when you look at the Bengals, they had nowhere to go but up from that first game of the year. And granted, they were able to put up points on the board in this game, but not enough. And to me, when I look at the Bengals got off to a slow start in this game. Didn't score any points, couldn't get any sort of offensive rhythm in the first quarter. And it wasn't until they were kind of down in a hole to be able to kind of get the gears going and finally get some consistency on the offense going. We got to see some production from T. Higgins. Excuse me. T. Higgins, in the first game of the year against the Browns, no catches. But in this game, he bounces back nicely for 8 catches, 89 yards, has 2 touchdowns. But just looking at the connection between Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, it seems like one that needs to be improved upon relatively quickly, just because when you look back at this game, Jamar only had 5 catches for 31 yards. Now, granted, you can give a lot of credit to the Ravens secondary for being able to focus on him pretty heavily throughout this game and forcing Joe Burrow to look to other targets to throw to within the offense. But overall, the Bengals starting off 0-2, I mean, it's a hole that they could dig themselves out of. We're only in the second week of the year going into week 3, but, man, that's not really a place you want to be. I still think when it comes to the Bengals, they could be able to reverse this trend. They can find some rhythm offensively, and then hopefully that rhythm that they can establish offensively can lead to a better defensive performance. I mean, when you look at these last 2 games defensively, they gave up 24 points in the first game. They gave up 27 in this game. So they're basically averaging giving up about 25 points per game. But I think if they're able to reverse the tide on offense, get some more points on the board, I think it's going to put the defense in a better position, get them off of their back heels, and then hopefully kind of swing the time of possession. Because when you look back at this game, the Ravens did a pretty good job with time of possession. I believe in this game, the Bengals only possessed the ball for 26 minutes compared to the 33 plus minutes that the Ravens had in this game when it came to possessing the ball. That's going to have to reverse as far as I see for the Bengals. The Bengals are going to have to get upwards of 30 to 35 minutes on the high side when it comes to possessing the ball, just because you're able to grind down that opposing defense. You get them tired. If they're on the field longer, you could expose them a little bit more easily. But until that trend reverses, I think it's going to be kind of a touch and go situation for the Bengals here. The Ravens are off to a 2-0 start. The Bengals got a lot of work to do here. But when it comes to the Ravens have been extremely effective against the Bengals over, I'd say, the last couple of years. The Ravens have won the majority of the matchups against the Bengals. And that's despite the fact that the Bengals have had technically more success recently than the Ravens, simply just because if you're looking at it from a perspective of a team making the Super Bowl, the Bengals have been the one team to actually make the Super Bowl of late compared to the Ravens. The Ravens haven't made a Super Bowl since, I believe, Super Bowl 47. So it's been quite some time since we've seen the Ravens make it to a Super Bowl. But as of right now, it looks like the Ravens have the upper hand in this matchup against the Bengals. And we'll see these teams go at it again later this year. But got to say, with the Ravens going on the road, getting a huge divisional win in week 2, it's setting them up quite nicely. And unfortunately for them, Odell Beckham did sustain an injury. He's going to be out for the next couple of weeks. I believe he suffered an ankle injury. You guys can quote me if I'm wrong there, but he's going to be out for the next couple of weeks. So the Ravens are going to have to make an adjustment. And obviously, with the Ravens coming off of the J.K. Dobbins situation where he suffered a torn Achilles in the first week of the year, you saw kind of I would say, a distributed workload between Gus Edwards and Justice Hill. I think that's going to be the tandem that they're going to run with for the rest of the year. And then obviously, you always have to keep in mind that Lamar could be a factor in the run game as well. Those 3 guys are going to have to be pivotal in the run game this year, simply just because when you lose J.K. Dobbins, that's a big blow to the running back core and to the running game as a whole for the team. So, despite that, they're off to a 2-0 start, and they're looking like one of the better teams in the AFC North right now. Right now, they are in first place with the rest of the division, either being 1-1 or 0-1. Not 0-1, 0-2, excuse me. But no, good win for the Ravens, and the Bengals got a lot of work to do here. So we definitely keep that in mind as we continue forward. After that, we are going to transition to the Miami Dolphins and New England Patriots game. This was the Sunday night matchup that we saw on NBC. The Dolphins win this game by the score of 24-17. This was a big win for the Dolphins simply just because their first 2 games of the year were on the road. Kind of won a shootout against the Chargers in the first week of the year for the season opener. And then going on the road to New England, going up against a pretty top flight defense. This is a big win for them. And, just looking back at this game in particular, I'm going to be honest with you guys. I thought the Dolphins should have won this game by a landslide. If you look at the effectiveness they were able to bring against that New England defense early on, New England really couldn't respond effectively to really these motions that Miami was running constantly throughout the game, where they would bring a receiver in motion for literally about a half second to a second. They'd snap the ball, and Tua's getting that ball out within a second. I'd say about a second and a half to about 2.5 seconds. When it comes to that type of offense, if you're looking at it from a New England defensive perspective, you're not able to bring an effective pass rush, just because if Tua's getting the ball out so quickly, sacks are just not going to be easy to come by. And there were multiple drives where, they were able to do those quick motions. It not only opened up the passing game for them, but it opened up run lanes because now the defense is on their back heels. And, you look at the run lanes, that's some of these runs that the Dolphins were able to establish with Raheem Mostert. They were quite effective. Raheem Mostert had that nice, I'd say, like 48-yard gain that ended up in a touchdown to put, I think it put the Dolphins up 24-10, if I remember correctly. This was in the fourth quarter. And it seemed like at that point that was the kill shot against the Patriots. But, got to give credit to the Patriots here. Despite the fact that they had a very slow start in this game, kind of similar to what we saw with them against the Eagles, the Patriots just kind of they hung around in this game. After going down 14 points, 24-10, they were able to lead a quick drive to put 7 points on the board. Got this game to a 24-17 margin. You look back at the Dolphins' ensuing drive, they weren't able to get anything of consistency. They couldn't really milk the clock to end the game or ice the game in their favor. And then, the Patriots have a situation where they have a potential game-time drive on the line, and they just weren't able to close it out. You had that extremely wacky play where Mack was able to get the ball out to Gesicki. Gesicki was about a yard and a half short of the line to gain to get a first down. He tosses the ball to Cole Strange, and Cole Strange gets within about a foot from getting a first down and continuing the drive late in the fourth quarter for the Patriots. But They initially gave the Patriots the first down, but based on review, they moved the ball back and they decided that Cole Strange did not make the line to gain for the first down, and it was a turnover on downs, and the ball was given back to the Dolphins, and then they ended up kneeling the game out from there. So looking at looking at it from a Miami perspective, I thought Miami was solid in this game. They were able to bring effective pass rushes against Mac Jones. They were able to get some turnovers against this Patriots offense, which seems to be very leaky with turnovers early on in the year. And I will say, when it comes to Tua, Tua has looked very good so far in the first 2 weeks of the year. I know a lot of people were concerned about his long-term health after all of the concussions that he sustained last year, but he looks good back there, and he's not taking a lot of hits early on in the year. So it does seem like the Dolphins have made a pretty good adjustment with protecting him. Hopefully it continues, and we get to see Tua play at a top flight level, just because he has looked like that so far early on this year. But I have to say that, Miami probably should have put up about 30, 35 points in this game. There were multiple times where you just felt like Miami controlled and dominated this game from beginning to end. But only winning this game by 7 points, I think there's still some room for improvement here when it comes to the Dolphins. I think they have a really good offense with how they're able to utilize their wide receivers with Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle. Then you could look at guys that are more kind of like plug-in players like Braxton Berrios. This is a good offense here. And I think that this offense can definitely put up 30 to 35 points consistently. But there are times where some of these drives, they just get stalled out and they have to either settle for a field goal or they have to settle for a punt. And that's despite the fact that within like the first couple of plays, they can gain 20, 30 yards pretty quickly. It's just, you get a penalty here, you get an errant throw there, or you just have a bad run play. Like, these types of plays can just throw off an offensive drive really quickly. And hopefully the Dolphins could be able to remedy those types of situations moving forward. And when it comes to the Patriots, look, obviously, if you guys are watching this, you can see all the Patriots stuff behind me. I'm a diehard Patriot fan. Been that my entire life. So I'm going to try to keep the bias in mind here. The first 2 weeks, if you've been a Patriot fan, it's been exciting. Granted, it hasn't ended in wins these first 2 weeks for the Patriots, but there's definitely potential with this team as far as I see it. The biggest concerns, obviously, from an offensive perspective, is the offensive line. There have been times where Mac has been pressured way too quickly, and he has no choice but to eat a sack or just get the ball out extremely quickly. And I will say, if the Patriots are able to fix these little offensive line issues, I shouldn't say little. This is probably the most critical problem when it comes to the Patriots offense at this point, is just the offensive line consistency. If they're able to address that early on, and hopefully they do, and then by the time we get to October, that situation is remedied. But if it's not, this situation is going to keep occurring over and over and over again, where the run game is struggling because of the offensive line inconsistencies. The passing game is going to be affected because, Mac is not going to have as much time to work with as he would probably want. But these first two games have pointed to me that this is not a Mac Jones issue. Mac Jones looks pretty good throughout these first 2 weeks so far. Granted, there are some plays where he's underthrowing the ball, and there are times where he's just throwing the ball into a bad one-on-one matchup. You could look at the Xavier Howard play where he was trying to hit Devontae Parker along the sideline for a potential touchdown, underthrows the ball by about 5 yards, and Howard ends up getting an interception. It ends up killing a great drive that New England was leading at that point in the game. And, when you look at Mac, I think Mac has been pretty good when it comes to his overall accuracy. I like the fact that Bill O'Brien has instilled in this offense of getting the ball out relatively quickly. New England really feasted in this game on these 7 to 8 yard pass plays where Mac is getting the ball out within about 2 seconds. I think that's an effective way of running the offense here. I wouldn't be surprised if the Patriots really start to use this hurry up offense, where they're getting back to the line of scrimmage extremely quickly and they're putting that opposing defense on their back heels. I think there's some things that they can definitely work on. The offensive line is definitely an issue, but it looks like Mac is able to get the ball out pretty effectively. Looks like the wide receivers are able to get some separation, and I think if they're able to continue their relationship with the tight ends, with Hunter Henry and Mike Gesicki, I believe that this is going to work out well for the Patriots offensively. It has to come down to the offensive line. if the offensive line can improve, open up run lanes for Ramondre Stevenson and Ezekiel Elliott, I think it's going to do wonders for them. It's early in the year. Granted, they're 0-2, not the start that they want to be in, but I definitely see some potential when it comes to the Patriots. I don't think this is a Mac Jones issue. I think it mostly has to do with the offensive line, and I think Bill O'Brien probably needs to improve on some of the play calls here. I'm not saying that he's been awful when it comes to these play calls. It's just that there's been some inopportune play calls that have really set drives back, and I think it's early in the season. That would probably get addressed as we go on, but as of right now, Patriots being an 0-2 hole, not the place they want to be in, but I do see a potential upside with them if they're able to correct these issues, because the Patriots have a good defense here. If they're able to do that offensive line fix, I think it could really set them up quite nicely. I'm not saying that they're going to win the AFC East. I still believe that the teams like the Dolphins and the Bills are the teams to beat in the division. But with the Jets looking like a floundering team with Zach Wilson leading the helm, the Patriots can find a way into that third spot in the division as far as I see it. So we'll move on from that game. We'll move on to the last game of discussion, and that is going to be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Chicago Bears. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they had their home opener this past weekend against the Chicago Bears, and they won this game by the score of 27-17. And I got to say, when it comes to the Buccaneers, they've been the biggest shock to me, just because I'm going to be honest with you guys. I did not expect them to move on well from Tom Brady. We saw Tom Brady last year lead this team offensively, and it was a struggle. It really wasn't because of him. I still think Tom was a great quarterback, despite the circumstances that he was faced with last year. But you look at this situation going into this year, you're moving on from Tom, you're bringing Baker Mayfield into the fold. And Baker has been an inconsistent quarterback throughout most of his career. Granted, there have been some highs in his career where he was able to lead the Browns to a wild card win. This was in the COVID year against the Steelers. And then there have been times where he's throwing the ball into highly contested areas, he's turning the ball over, and he just hasn't been an effective quarterback at times throughout his career. But I have to say, Baker's been solid for them so far. You look back at this game, 26 of 34, 317 yards passing, got a touchdown to Mike Evans on a beautiful pass where Mike Evans was able to beat that one-on-one coverage along the sideline. This offense is doing pretty well. I mean, really, this is a night and day difference from what we saw last year, where there were times where the Bucks could just not move. They could not generate any sort of offense and move the ball down the field. I mean, sometimes scoring 17, 20 points was a struggle for them, just based on the bad offensive line play that we saw from them last year. Looking at these first two games, Baker's been able to move around the pocket pretty effectively. There are times where he can bounce it out and pick up some yards on the ground, but overall, he looks to be protected pretty well this year. And offensively, they've been able to establish some good drives. It's early on in the year. I'm kind of like a broken record at this point when it comes to it being early in the season, just because we're not seeing these teams really fully running and gunning yet to their top potential, just because it's September, we're only in week 2, and things will improve. But I have to say, this offense has potential to really put some high points up here. Now, granted, they are playing the Bears, and I do have to keep that within context, because the Bears, unfortunately, it just doesn't look like they're going anywhere of significance with Justin Fields leading the way. And on top of that, just the offensive play calling from the Bears seems to be anemic as well. So, the Bears could be in a bad situation here for the rest of the year, and it's kind of indicative of where they've been for the last 10 plus years. But, just to focus on the Bucs here, the Bucs have been, like I said, they've been the biggest shock to me the first 2 weeks of the year. They're off to a 2-0 start. They're basically going toe-to-toe with the Saints in the division. And to me, it's going to come down to whether or not that they can best the Saints in this division. Just because I look at the Falcons and I look at the Panthers, the Falcons have a chance to be able to make things interesting based on where they are in the NFC South. But I think for the most part, it's going to come down to the Bucs and the Saints when it comes to what I've seen for the first 2 weeks. I did not have that situation playing itself out when I was looking at the NFL season before it started. I thought it was mostly going to come down to the Saints being the top dog by a mile, and then everybody else kind of playing for second. But it looks like the Bucs have really kind of set themselves up as either second place, or you could even say the 1B to the Saints 1A as far as I see it. it's gonna be very interesting to see how both of these teams battle it out in the NFC South. But man, the Bucks look pretty good so far. Offensively, they're putting up points. They're establishing good drives. They're not turning the ball over. That can't happen with a Baker-led offense. So time will tell on that. But you compare that, or you combine that, with what they have defensively. This is a pretty solid team. I'm not going to say that they're like the best team in the NFC just because they have a 2-0 start, but they're definitely a team of interest here moving forward. And we'll see how things play out for the Bucks in the long run. But defensively, they're getting turnovers. In this game, they got a pretty much what I would consider was a game icing pick six from Shaq Barrett. These are the things that you want to see, especially where the Bucks were expecting to be. I shouldn't say where the Bucks were expecting to be. I should say the expectations that people had of the Bucks going into the season were far more pessimistic of where things ended up being based on these first 2 weeks. And it is kind of a nice thing to see. So, a tip of the cap to the Bucks on starting pretty effectively throughout the first 2 weeks of the year, and we'll see how things transpire for the rest of the month, and then going into kind of the middle of the season where they could be able to establish a strong foothold in the NFC South along with the New Orleans Saints. But pretty much it's going to wrap everything up for me, you guys. I wanted to keep it relatively light today. Just wanted to focus on some of the games of note from this past weekend in week 2. Obviously, I apologize for not putting out any content outside of the one episode last week. I just got caught up with work, and it's just been a busy schedule for me over the last couple weeks. But definitely wanted to get something out covering really the things of notice or just the topics of notice from week 2. I'll try to put out another episode by the end of the week previewing some of the week 3 matchups in the NFL. We'll see how things shake up with some of these teams that have had a hot start compared to a cold start. We'll see if those hot teams can continue their winning ways. We'll see if these teams that have had a tough start, are digging themselves in a hole, can dig themselves out of it, and try to, get on the right path here going towards the end of the month of September. But I'll try to get another episode out, like I said, by the end of the week. If I don't, I'll be back next week with another episode covering the week 3 games of note once we reach that point. But once again, you guys, thank you guys for tuning in. If you guys have been following us on social media, we definitely appreciate your support. And until next time, you guys, take it easy and have a nice day.